Hi, good day everyone. With me again, Lady Trialdi in Introductory Macroeconomics class. Having understood the main concerns in macroeconomics, now I would like to explain about the related macroeconomic indicators and their measurements that hopefully would allow us to evaluate the economic situation. Here are the three main indicators in macroeconomics. The first indicator, economic growth, basically measures the growth of economic output, by which we can observe the overall change in economic productivity or performance. Before measuring economic growth, we will soon get acquainted with the concept of GDP or gross domestic product. Then the second indicator, inflation rate, it measures the increase of overall price level in an economy, indicating the cost of living of people. In this case, we will learn about how to measure the price index for calculating the inflation rate. The last indicator is unemployment rate. The measurement is more straightforward compared to the former two indicators, but the correct identification of employment data will be needed. Let us now comprehend the first concept, the GDP. This is the definition of GDP in ManQ textbook. Then we may look at the following keywords to understand what output is included or excluded from the GDP calculation. Based on the definition, here are what GDP excludes. First is non-tradable output, or output used for self-consumption like those produced and consumed by a family. Since the output is not traded, thus the market value is non-existent. Output produced and sold illegally in a black market is also not included in GDP. Intermediary output or raw materials are not consumed. They are used as input in production process of other output. Since they are not final output, they are also excluded from the GDP. GDP also excludes used output or output produced in the past and output produced outside the domestic economy. The first approach to measure GDP is the expenditure approach. Remember the circular flow? Since the market value of goods and services produced in an economy are equal to the total value of expenditures of all people in the economy, we can use this approach to calculate GDP. The first element of GDP in this approach is consumption, which is all spending made by households except the purchases of new housing. New housing is categorized as investment, the second element, just like firm spending on factory, equipment, and business inventory, as they are used to produce more goods and services in the future. How about the purchases of stocks, bonds, and other securities? In GDP calculation, they are not categorized as investment because the transaction do not result in production of output. For the same reason, transfer payment made by the government is not part of the government spending. The last component of GDP by expenditure is net export. Exported commodities are purchased by foreign citizens but produced by domestic economy, hence included in the GDP calculation. On the other hand, although imports are spending made by domestic citizens, but since the commodities are not domestically produced, they are deducted from the GDP calculation. The second approach to calculate GDP is the income approach. Again, using the circle flow logic, we can use this approach since in an economy, expenditures equal income. Look at this. Here is GDP when we break it down until we get disposable personal income. To obtain the GDP, we just need to reverse the process and the sign. Transfer payment and interest income, for instance, that have nothing to do with the production of domestic output, are deducted from the GDP calculation. On the other hand, the indirect taxes, the depreciation, and the net payment to foreigners who produce domestic output are added to get the GDP, as their values are reflected in the market value of the domestic output. So in short, here is the GDP calculation using income approach. The last approach is called the production approach. We may sum the value added of all sectors of productions or sum the total sales of all final products and the changes in inventory. Summing the value added means we omit the value of all output that served as input of production. Therefore, double counting problem can be avoided. Summing the value added will be just the same with summing the total sales of all the final products. Both represents the market value of the final products. However, now the potential problem may come from the changes in inventory. To avoid double counting problem, unsold output or new inventory must be included in the GDP calculation as it is treated as final output produced in current year. On the other hand, the sales of inventory must be deducted from the GDP since its value has been added in the past GDP calculation. After knowing the concept and the measurement of GDP, calculating economic growth is relatively easy. Here is the formula. Worth noting, however, since GDP is expressed in terms of value or quantity times price level, to find the economic growth or the growth of the quantity only, then we cannot let the price changes. It is only possible if we calculate the growth using the GDP with constant price or the so-called real GDP. The difference between the real GDP and its opposite, the nominal GDP, can be seen from the formula here. These price factors is the difference using base price or current price. Of course, the overall price can only be measured using index as we will later explore. But for now, it is enough to say that the index is called GDP deflator and it is simply defined as the ratio of nominal GDP to real GDP. Okay, that's about GDP and economic growth. While economic growth could indicate how well an economy has performed or developed, GDP itself is a strong indicator, albeit not perfect, of a country's standard of living. It shows how big the economy is, how high the level of income and the expenditure of the people are, or how high the productivity of the economy is. Obviously, GDP omits the followings. However, it is worth noting that country with a high GDP is more likely to get such quality of life as better education, cleaner environment, or more adequate health services. Many of the quality of life indicators also evidently have positive correlation with GDP. Inflation is another important indicator in macroeconomics. It is an increase in the overall price level in the economy. The opposite is called deflation, but please don't mess it up with disinflation, because disinflation is not a decrease in prices, but the decrease in the inflation rate. So the overall price level in an economy may continue to rise during this inflation period. Measuring inflation, like measuring economic growth, need to use index. The two most common price indices are the CPI or Consumer Price Index and the GDP deflators. Let's find out the difference. Before calculating the price index, we need to determine the basket of commodities, the price of each commodity in the basket, and the basket cost. While CPI is using fixed baskets of commodities consumed, as the name suggested, GDP deflator is using different baskets of commodities produced. So here is the index calculation. The basket cost is one particular year is divided by the basket cost in the base year. Here again, the fixed basket in CPI calculation and the different basket in GDP deflator calculation. After finding the CPI or the GDP deflator figures in specific years, the inflation rate is simply the growth rate of the two price indices. Inflation rate calculation using CPI and GDP deflator will be different if there is a significant change in price of imported goods or price of capital goods. Imported goods are included in the CPI as they are purchased by domestic consumers, but they are excluded in the GDP deflator as imported goods are not domestically produced. As for the capital goods case, the opposite occurs. Capital goods are included in the GDP deflator calculation, but are excluded in the CPI calculation since the purchases are categorized as investment, not consumption. Computing inflation using the CPI may also overstate the true inflation rate. The calculation of unemployment rate is more straightforward. We know the terms population in an economy. The working age population or manpower is part of the population, and those who are ready to work, they are now in the labor force. The percentage is what we know as the labor participation rate. Of course, not all working age people in the labor force can get a job and work. Some of them are unemployed. the percentage of the unemployed labor force. That's what we call the unemployment rate. Okay, that's all my brief explanation about main macroeconomic indicators at the moment. Make sure you can comprehend the concept of GDP and the three approaches to measure it before distinguishing nominal and real GDP and measure economic growth. From the calculation of GDP, we can also find the GDP deflators, which is an alternative like the CPI to measure inflation rate. Thank you for your attention. See you again in other videos with different basic macroeconomics topics.